So picture this. A revolution is fought to completely destroy capitalism. But then, just a few years later, its leaders turn around and embrace it. Now, this isn't some alternate history novel. This is exactly what happened in the early Soviet Union. It was Lenin's most desperate and, you could say, most controversial gamble. By 1921, you have to understand the communist dream was turning into a total nightmare. Yeah, they'd won the brutal civil war, but that victory felt pretty hollow. The country was just shattered. The economy had basically ceased to exist, and the very people the revolution was supposed to save were now starving. The whole project was teetering on the edge of collapse. And the numbers, they're just devastating. Industrial production down to a fifth of what it used to be. A massive famine was killing millions of people. But for Lenin, the real alarm bell, the thing that really shook him, was the Kronstadt Rebellion. See, these weren't some old enemies of the state. These were the sailors who had been hailed as heroes of the revolution. And now they were rising up against the Bolsheviks' policy of war communism, which was basically just the state showing up and taking all the grain from the peasants. When your own heroes turn on you, you know your system is fundamentally broken. So what does Lenin do? Well, being the ultimate pragmatist, he pulls a move that nobody saw coming. He announces a strategic retreat. To save his socialist revolution, he was going to have to, for a little while anyway, embrace the very system he'd sworn to destroy. This new plan was called the New Economic Policy, or NEP for short. Okay, so what was this NEP all about? The core idea was actually pretty simple, but totally radical for the time. The state would stop just taking everything. Instead, it would take a specific amount of grain as a tax, a fixed amount. And the rest, well, the peasants could sell it on the open market and keep the profit. For the first time in years, farmers actually had a reason to grow more than they needed just to survive. Now, you can imagine, Lenin had to sell this wild idea to his party, and a lot of them were horrified, right? So he frames it not as a failure, but as this brilliant tactical move. He argued this wasn't the end of socialism. No way. It was just a little detour, a necessary compromise to regain their strength before they could push forward again. One step back to take two steps forward. And you know what? It worked. It worked spectacularly. The second you gave peasants an incentive, production just exploded. Agricultural output jumped by a whopping 40%. Suddenly, there was food in the markets again. The famine started to fade, and the economy, which had been completely flatlining, suddenly had a pulse. It was, without a doubt, a huge success. But here's the thing about economics. You solve one problem, and you almost always create a brand new one. And this new problem was bizarre, dangerous, and it got a really, really catchy name. It was called the Scissors Crisis. And honestly, the name's perfect, because if you actually graph the prices, the line for farm goods went down, way down, while the line for industrial goods went up, way up. They crossed and spread apart just like an open pair of scissors. So you had tons of cheap food from the booming farms, but industry was still a wreck, so the few manufactured goods they produced were ridiculously expensive. And this created a total deadlock. Imagine you're a farmer. You've got tons of cheap grain to sell, but the price of a simple shovel or a new pair of boots is just astronomical. So you start to think, why should I even bother selling my grain? Meanwhile, in the city, the factory workers are desperate for that food, but the farmers are starting to hoard it because there's nothing useful for them to buy. The whole trade system between the city and the countryside was about to just stop. Seriously, the whole situation was absurd. You can't run an economy like that. The system was crying out for a solution, for someone who could bridge that massive gap, a middleman. And so, into this vacuum stepped a whole new class of people. These were your classic private entrepreneurs, traders, small-time manufacturers, merchants, who saw an opportunity in this new market. And they got a nickname, usually not a friendly one, the NEP men. And get this, these guys weren't just some sideshow, they were the whole show. In just a year, these private traders were handling nearly 75% of all retail trade in the entire country. Think about that. They were the ones actually getting goods to the farms and food to the cities. They were absolutely essential. And at the same time, they were absolutely hated. For the old-school, hardcore Bolsheviks, the NEP men were just the ultimate betrayal. They were seen as greedy profiteers, as parasites getting rich off the system. They were the walking, talking embodiment of capitalist greed that the revolution was supposed to have destroyed. Seeing these newly rich traders driving nice cars while loyal party members were living simple, austere lives, It was infuriating. So you get this really weird, contradictory situation. The state desperately needs the NMN to keep the economy from falling apart, but at the very same time, it's doing everything it can to punish and control them. They were attacked in official propaganda, they were slapped with crippling taxes designed specifically to keep them from getting too successful, and they were even stripped of basic rights, like the right to vote. They were, in short, tolerated but never ever accepted. For a few years, this strange, messy, contradictory policy managed to pull the Soviet Union back from total disaster. But it couldn't last forever, you know? The tension between its capitalist engine and its communist ideals was just too much to handle. And this leads us to one of modern history's greatest what-ifs. Because after Lenin dies, the whole debate over the country's future just intensifies. And by 1928, Joseph Stalin is in charge, and he has zero patience for this kind of compromise. He initiates what he calls the Great Break, and just like that, boom, the NEP is over. It's replaced by the brutal top-down policies of forced collectivization and breakneck industrialization. The experiment was officially done. And this is where historians still argue today. It really boils down to one fundamental question. What was the NEP? Was it just a temporary retreat like Lenin claimed? A shaky, unstable compromise that was always going to fail? Or was it something more? Could it have actually been a different path to socialism? A kind of state capitalism that might have eventually turned into a more stable mixed economy, maybe even avoiding the absolute horrors of Stalinism? And that's the question that just hangs over this entire period, isn't it? The NEP proved, for a short time at least, that a little bit of market pragmatism could get results that rigid ideology just couldn't. It leaves us with that ultimate what if. What might have happened if they'd stayed on that road not taken?